So last Friday night, I attended a Green Bay Gamblers hockey game with my wife and my parents. My parents house some of the players for the Chicago Steel hockey team, and so whenever they are playing against a team where I live, whether that was in Iowa where I went to college or now here in Green Bay, my parents will make the trip and use it as an excuse to come visit, grab some dinner, see a hockey game, and be the only away fans in a stadium full of aggressive Green Bay fans. So last Friday, as we walked into the Resch Center to see it, the hockey game, we were walking in, and there's all the crowds, and all of a sudden someone points and goes, "What's that?" And I look over, and there's a huge man in a Chewbacca costume. And it was at that moment that I realized it was Star Wars night. And as a self-proclaimed Star Wars nerd, that was what I grew up on, reading and watching and enjoying. I'll be the first to say that I should have known it was a sign of what was to come. Because if there's one thing that every Star Wars fan knows, is that most Star Wars fans are, as those of us within the church like to say, uniquely made and loved by God. So we walked in, we found our seats, and my dad went to get some drinks for him and my mom. And at this point, they also realized that it was $3 beer night. And so I thought to myself, look, okay, we got Star Wars mega fans, and we got really cheap beer. What could go wrong? So we're walking around the stadium, we find our seats, I hear a voice calling our names, and we turn around, and there's Brian Brookley and the boys, and then Joel and Jody Krogh. So we go and talk to them for a few minutes, find out how many games they've been to, just, catch up, and then we go back to our seats. And as I'm sitting there, there's four of us. There's my dad, my mom, Janessa, myself. Then there's 5 open seats before the next group. And this is when the new character walks in. Entering the row, tripping over both us and herself, is a cosplayer dressed up in a bright white and pink outfit with a bright white and pink wig. And she sits down next to me, and in the time it took her to say, "Hello, seat neighbor," there were about 5 different drinks I could smell in her breath. And out of curiosity, I had to ask, "What did you dress up as?" And she said, "I'm a hologram from a ship, so don't tell anyone I escaped." So throughout the course of the next 3 periods, and then overtime, she kept leaving and returning, either with more alcohol or a certain substance on the air around her. And every time, despite there being 4 more seats, she would continue to sit right next to me, close enough to feel the wig on my shoulder and her arms flailing in front of my face. And there I sat, a pastor, next to a cross-faded Star Wars cosplayer. And I wish I could say that I shared the gospel or, did some pastoral thing with her like, "Hey, you need Jesus. These won't heal you." But instead I sat there thinking, man, I'm glad I'm not like her. I'm better than her because, I follow Jesus. And my life is somewhat in order. And there I sat, someone employed by a church who's actively preaching and routinely preaching to the youth group about, everyone is deserving of the gospel and no one's too far from God to be saved, and that we need to take every opportunity that's laid at our feet to share about the good news. And I spent about 2 hours sitting next to someone who was clearly looking for community, connection, fulfillment, and a place to belong, and said nothing about Jesus. Instead of inviting her to hear about Jesus, who could provide all those things that she was looking for and more, I thought to myself, I'm better than her. Because I've been following Jesus for a while, right? I'm more deserving of Christ because even if she chose to follow him now, I've got 18 years on her. So welcome to Lakeside Church. My name is Jacob. I am the next-gen pastor here, and I have the privilege of opening up our new series here, Road to Redemption, for you guys this morning. And so we're going to be looking at the parable of the workers out of Matthew chapter 20, and we have several options if you want to follow along. First of all, if you have a physical Bible, it's in Matthew chapter 20. Matthew is the first book of the New Testament, and it's one of the 4 accounts of the life and teachings of Christ. If you have a smart device, you can download what's called the YouVersion Bible app. It's a free resource that we use every week here. You can go in there, then you can tap to the events page and either turn on your location services or just search Lakeside Algoma, and all the verses will pop up there for you. And then lastly, all the verses will also be on the screens to my right and left. And lastly, if you're joining via the live stream, thank you for joining us. The verses will be on the screen below me. So let's jump in. At this point in the book of Matthew, Jesus is in the midst of a long string of teachings and parables. The story directly preceding this chapter was the story of the rich young ruler who came to Jesus and said, "Master, what must I do to receive salvation?" And Jesus presented a lot of challenges for him. He said, he listed all the rules, he listed all the commands, like, here's all the things you must do. And the rich young ruler said, "I've done those things." And Jesus said, "Leave all your possessions and follow me." And at that, the rich young ruler left. And so after the young ruler left, Jesus told his disciples, this is in Matthew 19, verse 30, "But many who are first will be last, and the last first." And then he begins this parable. So let's jump in. Matthew 20, verses 1 through 2. It says, "For the kingdom of heaven is like a master of a house who went out early in the morning to hire laborers for his vineyard. After agreeing with the laborers for a denarius a day, he sent them into his vineyard." So the story opens up with Jesus saying, "Hey, I'm going to tell you a truth about the kingdom of heaven." We're introduced to a guy who's called the master of the house, or in other words, he owns a vineyard. So he's got a lot of money. And this vineyard owner needed to find some laborers for the day to go and work his field. And so in the first century, it was commonplace that if you owned a vineyard or you owned a field or you just needed people to work for you for the day, you go down to the marketplace in the early morning, and there you could find day laborers who were just hanging out, waiting for a job. You go up to them, you say, "Hey, here's what I need. Can you do that?" "Yes." "Okay, here's how much I'm willing to pay. Are you okay with that?" "Yes." And then you take them to work. The master negotiated to pay his workers 1 denarius for the day, which was a typical day's wage at that time. And then after the agreement, the workers went to the vineyard and got to business. We read on, verses 3 through 7. "And going out about the 3rd hour, he saw others standing idle in the marketplace. And to them he said, 'You go into the vineyard too, and whatever is right I will give you.' So they went. Going out again about the 6th hour and the 9th hour, he did the same. And about the 11th hour he went out and found others standing, and he said to them, 'Why do you stand here idle all day?' They said to him, 'Because no one has hired us.' He said to them, 'You go into the vineyard too.' So the master went back to the marketplace and hired more workers around the 3rd, the 6th, the 9th, and the 11th hours. And so according to our clock, these would be about 9 a.m., 12 p.m., 3 p.m., and 5 p.m. What were these workers doing? They were waiting. They were waiting in the marketplace for the opportunity to work. In verse 3, it says, he saw others standing idle in the marketplace. The Greek word translated here to mean idle is argos. And it means not just that they're lazily standing around. It not means they're just standing there because they don't want to work, but rather they're waiting for the opportunity to work. They're waiting for a chance to work and provide for their household. They weren't standing idle because they didn't want to work. They were standing idle because they didn't yet have an opportunity before them. And so when they were hired, the master would tell them, "I'll pay you whatever's right." And so these laborers probably just assumed, okay, average day's work, you get about 1 denarius, depending on when I'm hired, I'll, fraction it out, whatever. So for example, if you're hired halfway through the day, you receive half a denarius. And that would seem fair to both us and to the other workers. And so imagine you're a high schooler, you just got your first job. Good job. You got a job. And likely you'll imagine that you would start at the bottom of the pay scale. You'll probably make less than everyone else there who's, been there longer and started with the same experience. I don't know what minimum wage is anymore, but McDonald's, I think it's about $10 per hour for minimum wage. And that's exactly what the new workers thought. They figured, these people have been working here longer, they'll be making more than me. I'll start at the bottom of the pay scale and work my way up. I'll accept what the master says is right. And an interesting point to look at is that the master didn't just hire at 12 p.m. He didn't even just hire at 3 p.m. He hired all the way up to 5 p.m. The average workday for a vineyard in that time ended at 6 p.m. because that's when it was getting dark, and so, you got to go home before it's dark because they didn't have street lamps to work in the fields with. And so the master continued to hire more workers when there was only 1 hour left in the day. A few summers ago, I worked for a company that did high-end deck building, and our crew included the owner, myself, and 3 other guys. We pretty much worked 7 a.m. to 5 p.m. unless it was rainy or the job finished early or we ran out of materials, whatever. In theory, we worked 7 a.m. to 5 p.m. And we had a tight schedule. We had to make sure we put out a great product, but at an efficient schedule because, with deck building, you can only do it during the summer. And if we were working for one day and our boss came back at, 4 p.m., because we end at 5, with a couple new workers, at first I think I'd be really confused. At first I think he was joking, or these were new hires for the next day. But then my second thought, as I saw them begin to work, would be, wow, we must really need to finish this job. By hiring new workers with just 1 hour left in the day, the master was revealing the urgency of the harvest. He was revealing that he needed to get the harvest done by the end of the day because it was important to him. And not only was the master urgent in trying to finish the harvest, but the workers he hired at that time were still waiting. If I was them, and I was standing in the marketplace, hanging out, waiting for a job, and it reached 5 p.m., I probably would have just gone home. I might have felt bad for myself. Oh, no, I couldn't find a job. I couldn't provide for my family. All those masters, they just didn't want to hire me today. And yet these workers who were hired at 5 were still standing and waiting. They were still hoping. They were still desperate for an opportunity to work. These workers were willing to go and do whatever necessary to provide for themselves and their family. These workers were, that word we referenced earlier, argos. They were eagerly waiting for the opportunity to work. We read on in verses 8 through 9. And when evening came, the owner of the vineyard said to his foreman, "Call the laborers and pay them their wages, beginning with the last up to the first." And when those hired about the 11th hour came, each of them received a denarius. When evening came, or when 6 p.m. hit, the owner went to the vineyard and said, "Hey, foreman," or "Hey, managers, bring all the workers around and we'll start the pay process. But start with the people who are hired at the end of the day. Start with the people who are hired at 5 p.m. Bring them around and then work your way back to those hired first thing in the morning. Begin with the last up to the first." So the people who waited around all day, people who are waiting for an opportunity to work, even for just an hour, were called up first. And these men who worked just 5 p.m. to 6 p.m., just one measly hour, received a whole denarius. And you might remember, the people hired in the morning were also promised a denarius. These men who worked for just an hour made a full day's worth of wages. And when I read this, I had two main thoughts pop into my head. First, why would the owner decide to start with the people least deserving of money rather than starting with the most? Because if I was in that headspace and I was going to pay two people the same amount of money, even though one was just started working and one had worked with me for a long time, I probably would have paid the one who was the most deserving of that money and kick him out of the room before I paid the other guy. Because I don't want to start a riot. I don't want that other guy who agreed to work for one denarius to know that I also paid this guy the same amount. And so if he already knew he was going to pay them more than was fair, why wouldn't he pay those most deserving first? And then secondly, how can that be fair? Like, honestly. Like, if I worked somewhere that paid $10 an hour, and someone came in for just an hour with the same experience, same skill set, same position, worked for just 1 hour, and we both made the same amount for that workday. We both made 12-hour workday, $10 an hour. If we both made $120, and he was only there for 1 hour, I would be furious. I would be upset. I would be angry. That's not fair. That's not just. I wouldn't understand. And I'm sure I'm not the only one in this room thinking that. As humans and people, we like things to be fair. We like things to be just. We like things to be in order. Okay, I did this, now I received this. I went here, now I do this. I'm someone who's very organized. I like to have my lists. I like everything to be justified along the left side of my page with a little equally sized dot. I spend way too much time making sure the little dots on my notes are the same size. Don't look at my notebook. But I like everything to be even. I like everything to be just. And when this happens, our natural inclination would be, that doesn't make sense. Let's read on, verses 10 through 12. Now when those who were hired first came, they thought they would receive more. But each of them also received 1 denarius. And on receiving it, they grumbled at the master of the house, saying, "These last worked only 1 hour, and you have made them equal to us who have borne the burden of the day and the scorching heat." The guys who worked the least made a denarius. They made a whole day's wage for just one measly little hour. And they probably spent half that time putting on their boots and gloves. The natural response of those who worked longer is to assume that they'll either receive a similar bonus, like, okay, if that guy received 12 times what he was supposed to receive, maybe I'll receive 12 denarius, or denarii. I don't know the plural of denarius. Or that there was a mistake. And yet that's not what happens. They all go up to the master, they all go get paid, and everyone gets paid the exact same amount. 1 denarius. 1 denarius whether you worked 12 hours or whether you worked 1. 1 denarius whether you had more experience or whether you have less. And as we would expect, as I would probably as well, the workers grumbled and complained to the owner, saying, these last, they only worked 1 hour. And you made them equal to us. You made them equal to me. And I was out here working and sweating and bearing the burden of both the heat and just a 12-hour-long workday. They only worked a little bit while the sun was going down, and yet they still made the same as me. They're so much less deserving. How could you do this to me? They worked 1 hour. How is that fair? These people only served you a little. What about those of us who served you all day? Through the heat, through the heavy lifting, whole day. I'm better, and I deserve more than them because they didn't do as much as I did. I deserve a whole denarius. They received 1/12. How could you make us even? And again, I understand that thought process. You might understand that thought process. Or maybe you're just much more giving than I am. It's possible. But what I can say is I understood that thought process last Friday at the hockey game. I'm better. I'm smarter. I'm more deserving. I don't need to share with her, though, because she's clearly far behind me. I'm fully deserving of God's love. I follow him, I serve him, I work for him, I moved to a different state for him. I made my life and my goals oriented around him. I made things harder on my wife and my family and my friends. But her? But a cross-faded pink hologram girl? She could get some grace at some point, but I'm here to hang out with my family and have a good time and watch a hockey game where we come back from the first period down and win in overtime. So I won't give her more than 1/12 of the gospel. A commentator, or in other words, a guy who read the Bible a lot and wrote about it a lot, named Craig Blomberg, wrote on this section, little seems more unequal than the equal treatment of unequals. I'll say that again. Little seems more unequal than the equal treatment of unequals. Did you notice who was complaining the most? Not those who were the most undeserving, not those who received the most. The people who complained about the equal treatment of people who they deemed unequal were those who were hired earlier in the day. How come they received the same I did? I worked the hardest part of the day. Or in our lives as Christians, how could that person receive the same grace that I've received? How could that person receive the same grace, the same redemption that I did? I served God when it was hard. I served God when friends and family mocked me. I served God when it was popular to portray Christians as bad people. I served God when it made me stand out and alone. And how can that person who's lived in unrepentant sin, who's a cheater, who's a liar, who's a murderer, who's a thief, who's an abuser, who's a drunk, who's a pink hologram girl, be offered the same amount of grace as I have? Little seems more unequal than the equal treatment of unequals. We move on to the owner's response in verse 13 through 15. But he replied to one of them, "Friend, I am doing you no wrong. Did you not agree with me for a denarius? Take what belongs to you and go. I choose to give to this last worker as I give you. Am I not allowed to do what I choose with what belongs to me? Or do you begrudge my generosity?" The workers are complaining, how can this be just? How could this be fair? And the master says, "Friend, I'm doing you no wrong. I'm paying you what you agreed to work for." The word translated here for friend is the Greek word heteros, which is generally used to address someone who, on a surface level, but there's some level of tension or aggression. It would be like if I'm in a movie theater and someone 2 rows in front of me is talking and on their phone, and I'd yell, "Hey, dude, quiet down." I don't know them. There might be a surface level I recognize them because we're in the same room for 2 to 3 hours, depending on the movie. But there's some level of tension there. The message says, "Dude, I didn't harm you in any way. When I talked to you this morning, we both agreed you'd make 1 denarius. Now take it and go." He goes on in verse 15, "Am I not allowed to do what I choose with what belongs to me? Or do you begrudge my generosity? Do you begrudge the fact that I'm being giving and loving to these other people who are also trying to support their family and make a way in this world?" A more literal translation would be, "Is your eye evil because I am good? Is my goodness causing you to be angry, envious? Or are you even beginning to hate me and the other people because I was giving to them?" In our lives, when we look at the church, do you ever feel jealous? Do we ever feel envious? And I'm not saying of, people's things or people's cars or people's houses, but rather, you might think to yourself, why isn't God blessing me as much as he's blessing that person? I followed Jesus my whole life. I fought for him. I've cried for him. I've tried to live a life pleasing to him. So why is that person who just became a believer last week receiving more spiritual blessings than me? I followed him for years. Why isn't he answering my prayer requests, but he's answering that person? How come he miraculously healed that person's ill family member, but not mine? Why did he bless that person with what looks like a healthy and happy family, but me and my spouse, we fight all the time? Why did he give that person so much charisma, but I shudder to even walk in the doors of a public building? I followed Jesus forever. Why does it feel like my prayers have less power than that newcomer, that sinner, that person who only worked for 1 measly hour? And when we think this way, we can begin to resent, we can begin to begrudge, and we can almost become angry with God. Our eye can become evil, not because of God's goodness, not because of God himself, because God would never cause us to become evil, but because of how we view his grace. Our eye can become evil because of how we view the grace God gives to others. How can we sit here, redeemed and saved sinners that we are, and expect God to give us more than those who have just begun to travel along the road? We need to remember that God's always fair. And because God never treats anyone unfairly, he also deals with all of us far more leniently than we deserve. A friend once told me that only fools appeal to God for justice rather than grace. Only fools appeal to God for justice rather than grace. Why? Well, would it be wrong to appeal to God for justice instead of grace? Again, we're humans. We want things to be even. We want things to be in line. We want our little dots on our notepad to be the same size. But let me just say that if God looked at me and chose to use justice instead of grace, when my time on this earth is through, you might feel the temperature around my body rise a little bit. Because only fools appeal to God for justice rather than grace, because only fools believe that they are worthy on their own merit. As believers in Jesus, we should all be able to recognize that without the grace that God has given to us through the death and resurrection of Christ, as we're about to celebrate in just a few weeks, we would all be found guilty of sin, deserving of death. But because of Christ's death, and because of his resurrection, and because of his biblical fulfillment of all the prophecies about him, such as the Isaiah 53 prophecy about Christ coming to earth and suffering as a servant for us, for our good, not for his good, for our good, that he takes away the punishment that we all deserve, and that we're given the opportunity to believe that all who are standing around, all of us who are idly waiting, all of us who are Argos, waiting for an opportunity to believe and be saved and follow Jesus, are given that chance. Because of what Christ did, not because of our merit. Because of God's grace, not his justice. Because of Christ's death and resurrection, we are given the chance to believe and be saved. And we finish up the text in verse 16 where it says, "So the last will be first, and the first last." In this short and simple verse, which I almost included on the other one because I felt kind of silly having a separate slide for it, Jesus wraps up his parable with the same exact words that inspired it. Think back to the rich young ruler. In this life, he's the first. He has money, he has possessions, he has everything. And yet if he's not willing to leave it behind in order to follow Christ, he will be last. When we come to God, it doesn't matter what we've done. It doesn't matter what we've done in the past, what we've done now, what we'll do in the future. What only matters is our faith and how we follow through. What matters is not our past, but our faith. All true disciples of Jesus, everyone who truly tries to follow him through every area of their life, are equal in the eyes of God. Regardless of when we come to Christ, regardless of what we did before we came to Christ, we all received the same grace, whether we served Christ all of our life or just for 1/12 of our life. We all receive the same grace. We all receive the same forgiveness. We all receive the same denarius. And so as we begin to wrap up here, I want to encourage you all that as believers, and again, as the title says, we're all on the road to redemption. If you are truly following Christ, or if you're not following him yet and you're trying to discover what that means and who he is, you're on the beginning stages of the road to redemption. And as travelers along this road, it is our goal to be looking towards Christ for forgiveness and redemption and salvation, rather than getting stuck looking at the past, rather than getting stuck looking at the things that we've done, rather than getting stuck on the things others have done. As the next-gen pastor here at Lakeside, a large part of my week is spent either coordinating or facilitating our student ministry nights on Wednesdays. If you're in 6th through 12th grade, or you know someone in 6th to 12th grade, send them down to the Algoma Youth Club. We eat dinner at about 6:15, play games, learn about Jesus. It's a whole lot of fun. And there's my plug that I had to do. I had to take the opportunity. But as the next-gen pastor, I'm constantly around kids who are having the same questions to differing levels as you guys might be. How can God love me with everything that I've done? And not only that, because even if I believe God loves me, how can I even possibly try to follow him with everything else going on in my life? How can I even possibly try to follow and obey and serve a God who loves me when everything around me is pulling me the other way? And my response is always some variation of, I know God can forgive you because he forgave me. I know God can forgive you because he sent Jesus to die for you. I know God can forgive you because he knows everything you've ever done and everything you ever will do and still loves you. But once you have a relationship with Jesus, you have to walk the walk. We can't just talk the talk and say, oh, I read the Bible every day and I know who Jesus is and he's a cool guy and, good. That's not how it works. It's a road. It's a road you have to travel. What good is a road if you just sit there? Once you have a relationship with Jesus, you have to travel the road of redemption. You have to live a life pleasing to God. You have to follow what he wants from you. Not perfectly, because God knows we aren't perfect. Trust me, God knows. Your spouse might know too. But what that practically means is we're putting Jesus at the center of everything we do. We're putting Jesus at the center of our desires. Coincidentally, last month was February, which includes Valentine's Day. And so when I did my semester planning back when I first got here in July and August, I planned, all right, February we're going to do a series on relationships, and it's going to be awesome. And then all of a sudden I see what the new series is for the adults also during the month of February. Just thought it was ironic that we both did relationship series. But what I was told them on the first week as we started our series on relationships was that we're called to keep Jesus at the center of our lives, our futures, and our relationships. And anything that would detract from us following him in any of those three areas should be cut off and left behind. Because when we believe in Jesus, he becomes the focal point of our identity and everything that we do. We identify ourselves with Jesus first, and he's the most important thing in our lives. And because of that, everything else has to follow suit. And as we're following and placing our identity in Jesus, what matters is not our past and what we've done before, but the grace that has been given to us and how we share that with others around us. And so you might remember that question I asked earlier. I had the question while reading and studying the text, why would the landowner choose to pay those least deserving first? He chose to do that to remind those of us who have been following God that his grace is sufficient for all of us. To remind us that in Christ we are all equals, regardless of when we started to follow or if we've been following him our whole lives. When we come to Christ, we are equally loved, equally forgiven, and equally redeemed. Whole day, 12th of a day, same denarius. To remind me that even though I followed Jesus for a while, even though I'm a pastor, even though I've sacrificed things for God, the only difference between me and the pink hologram girl sitting next to me at the hockey game is that I've heard, I've believed, and I travel the road of redemption. And if she believed this very same day that she would receive the very same denarius that I received, she would receive the very same grace that we have received. Only fools appeal to God for justice instead of grace, and what matters is not what we've done in our past, but how we believe and follow Jesus now. If you haven't placed your faith in Jesus yet, and you haven't joined this road to redemption yet, come talk to myself, Pastor Brian, any of our other staff or elders here after the service. The most important decision you will ever make is whether or not you place your trust and your hope in Jesus Christ. Let's pray. Lord God, thank you for this morning that we could gather together to contemplate and consider what it means to be redeemed, what it means to be equal through grace. Pray that you just give us the hearts to hear and realize that we're no better than anyone else, apart from the fact that we've heard your name. Pray that you give us the ability to go out into the world and share the good news of great joy that you have given to us. I pray that as we're entering this season, heading into Good Friday and Easter, that you would just remind us of who you are and what you've done for us and what that means. Not just that we're saved, but that you saved us. Continue to bless us as we go throughout our week, God. I pray that you just bring us back next week as we continue along this series, learning about what it means to be redeemed through faith in you. It's in your name we pray. Amen.